Hi, I'm Arthur Zakowitz, and welcome to Street Talk. This is where we share the latest trends and insights about fashion apparel, technology, retail, and consumer behavior from industry leaders and experts, while also answering a key question: what does fashion and retail mean for you? Today, we welcome Jesica Elise Wagstaff, who is the author of a Sunday Journal, a fashion theory newsletter, which we'll get into in a second. And I've read that you've been described as a fashion theorist for the social age of today or something. What does that mean? And welcome.
Thank you. Great question because I don't know that I would consider myself a theorist. At best, I am distilling fashion theory for pop culture. I have quite a few books right above my head here that I consult regularly, much smarter brains than I have. But what I do think that I am able to do is really capture both what has already been said and learned about the social condition and how people are feeling today. First, I am a consumer as well, and so my sole focus is to really capture some of the anxiety that we feel as consumers, some of the questions we have that are left unanswered, and simply why we behave the way we do when we interact with fashion.
I was just thinking about that, about two things, and one was buyer's remorse, and the other was like shopping as therapy. Is that real?
You know, it's funny. I don't know. I think there's definitely buyer's remorse, but I don't know that I would have said that there isn't a such thing as shopping as therapy before maybe the last year or so. You know, I've had quite a few people close to me go through a lot of major health scares and major health issues. And all of them have come to me and said, "Well, I just feel like shopping." And I said, "You know what? You should. You absolutely should. You should buy the thing that will make you feel better." But I think that at the same time, they aren't going into that level of consumption carelessly. They're really thinking about what would soothe them, what would make them feel whole again. And I think that's a very real sentiment that should be addressed, and shouldn't be taken lightly. Now, buyer's remorse, I think, is a very different beast. You're really sort of going into something, I think, haphazardly, or you're trying to quell an emotion that you haven't really gotten to the bottom of. And therefore, when you're shopping to soothe that emotion and not really soothing what physically might be ailing you or to suit a very specific need that you might be having.
You've written extensively about how TikTok has evolved into an engine for aspiration-based consumption. From where you sit and your perspective, do retail brands actually understand what's driving purposes from their content, or why they mistakenly kind of deploy the wrong strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that TikTok is really sort of put virality into superdrive. It's definitely shifted the trend cycle into a much faster moving engine than I think that it should be in. Certainly faster than I think customers want it to be. But I think that in part, brands are really forgetting about brand identity. I think as we've shifted online, and not into in-store experiences. What shoppers are looking for, what consumers are really looking for is style genres and how they can sort of adapt trends to the specific style genre that they're looking for. You've seen a lot of Gen Zers really shop with an eye towards hyper specificity, really making sure that those genres are as personalized as possible. But you still have older generations who are looking to kind of shop within the style genre that they're comfortable with. That comes down to brand identity. If we don't know where to go for what we're looking for, then the viral moment doesn't really matter. For example, I was on the websites for H&M, J.Crew, and Zara back in January, and all three of them had a banner on their women's site with a blue and white striped shirt, a red sweater, and a pair of chinos. And I said, "Oh, well, that went viral back in 2025." So they're really trying to capture that laggard shopper, that late adopter to that trend, which makes sense. But they forgot about brand identity. Only J. Crew offered the classic, sweater and a shirt combination, but Zara and H&M are supposed to be design driven, and they're offering the same thing. So it's kind of like, okay, well, what are we really doing here? And I think that sort of lack of brand identity when you're trying to capture those viral moments can lead to a level of cynicism and could come across as really greedy to the consumer.
What do consumers expect in an online shopping experience, do you think?
I think they want to have a site that gives them a very specific feel for the brand. So if you say that you're a luxury brand or you're offering luxury for less, you still want to have a site that feels luxurious, that's easy to navigate. You want to have a website that feels very clean, that invites the customer to keep poking around. And I think sometimes we forget that if you show us an outfit, show us the outfit. Where can we actually get all of the pieces? And I think a lot of times, especially for direct to consumer brands, you're putting other brands in there that we can actually shop on your website, which I think makes sense, but also let us know if you do have a partnership with a specific brand or if you have something that is not available here. Point us in the right direction for where we can go. Don't simply show us an outfit that we can't shop or that we can't buy.
Yeah, you pointed to Coach, Kurt Geiger and other brands as signals that creators are cooling on peak status emulation. If you were advising a mid-tier retail brand today, what's the opportunity and what's the trap, do you think?
I think the opportunity is to take advantage of personal style. That is a trend that we're seeing across all of the platforms, and people are really using that trend to answer to the problem of fast moving trend cycle. And so people want something that not only speaks to and reflects their own identity, but they want something that still feels modern and fresh. So you can offer that by making sure that customers know where to go for the item that they're looking for, right? Like there is, I think, a real missed opportunity in the fact that brand identity has really slipped. One of the conversations that I think is really interesting right now is that millennials are really kind of coming out and saying, well, if you like this brand's really similar. And I think the latest one that I saw was if you like the row, Eileen Fisher is right there, right? And so it's reminding people that you can get a lot of the looks at a very different price point than what you're originally being introduced to them at. And you can certainly shop the look for less, but you can also get the same or better quality oftentimes, and really have a piece that feels like you want it to feel for you and feel comfortable. Not all of us have $1,000 to spend on an outfit. And so I think just leaning into that brand identity and being able to be the first place that a consumer thinks about when they are shopping goes a very long way.
There's a version of democratizing fashion where brands sell, and a version of that's happening, just like kind of low price aspiration at a lower price tag, I guess. How do retail executives tell the difference? And does the consumer, do they care? Does it matter to them?
I think consumers care to an extent, but what is really happening is you have a brand that relies too heavily on storytelling and not quality. You have a brand that is selling you a fantasy instead of a product that's really reliable. And I think if you, as a retailer, if you are relying too heavily on that storytelling, you're probably losing your customer. We have become a lot smarter about quality, about fabrication, about the entire process, because that information is what's really democratized, not the clothes themselves. And so if you have a product that customers know, okay, yeah, there might be some heritage there, but part of the heritage is that this bag will last for generations. That's what customers care about. If they care about having something that feels really unique and interesting and isn't what everyone else is looking at or what everyone else is gravitating toward, that's also leaning into that same strategy of having something that is part of brand identity and not necessarily this fanciful storytelling. I think we have really cooled on that as consumers. We're not buying it because the product itself is not reliable. Therefore, the story falls apart very quickly for us. And once that happens, I think you lose your consumers.
Just going back to brand identity. When I'm shopping online, there's a certain kind of brand identity that's kind of pushed forward. When I go in a store, it's a little bit different. How do you make sure that your brand identity is consistent? And is that important? Should it be, or does it depend on the channel?
I think it is incredibly important, and I think we're seeing brands that struggle with that really struggle to overcome a slump, and I hate to hit J.Crew here, but I think that they're a really good example of that sort of slump. They've lost, I think, a sense of the city to country set, and therefore the products look almost too accessible. A lot of times the quality isn't there. And so you're expecting one experience online. And then when you go into the store and you're actually feeling things or you're seeing how items are styled, it's not lining up with either what the consumer wants to look like, or it's not lining up with what we think we're being told, right? Like a lot of times the styling in store can feel very different than how an influencer styled something or how even it's presented on a model. And it's a lot harder to put something on a mannequin and have it
I,
translate. That sort of depersonalization is really hard to overcome. And then you're kind of left with the product, and if the product doesn't stand up, then that's
sure.
where that loss of confidence comes in. That's where that sort of lack of trust comes in. And so I think that brands should really focus on maybe identifying how consumers see them and then making sure, okay, where are we filling in the gaps? And be really honest about that. If consumers don't see you in the light that you want to see yourself, how can you bridge that gap and make sure that experience is consistent across both mediums?
So who's doing it right? What brands understand that and are deploying the right merchandising and branding? Do you think?
Y- Good question. It's actually, I feel like I'm a little bit in the hot seat for that. I do think Coach is doing that brilliantly. They've been incredibly consistent over the years, making sure that customers know that they're still a quality product. They have kind of dialed into some of the trends without completely going over the top and abandoning their original customer. So you have the more traditional classic pieces for a customer that's come in the 70s or 80s, or even a customer that is new that wants that aesthetic, or you have customers who want something that's really trendy, really comfortable or colorful, really, I think, has the bag charms and all that, and they've been able to do that in a way that feels authentic to Coach, right? Coach is sort of a New York brand. They haven't lost sight of that. And they've really been careful about thinking about those details. So, for example, and I did not buy it, but I was on their website recently and saw that they had a little cassette charm. And as a 44-year-old woman, I thought, I want a cassette charm. Like I want to kind of tap into that nostalgia. I wanted to, and then I had to remember I don't have bag charms. That's not part of my look, but they almost had me. And so it's one of those things where you're really thinking about what your brand identity is, what the customers thinks your brand identity is, and really nailing that consistently.
Going back to what's on your shelf, what are you reading? Um, and it seems that your reading list is more philosophy seminar than fashion week. So what are you reading these days?
Absolutely.
And how does it translate into something that a merchandiser or CMO could use? The learnings.
You know, yeah, fashion theory is really interesting because the industry and even the consumer is always focused on the wearer. The fashion theory really reminds us there's an observer, and the observer can be real, it can be imagined, but the observer really captures the societal impact that fashion has on us, right? The observer reminds us that we are being seen a specific way. It reminds us of the systems that are at play when we adapt a certain style or when we want to incorporate a certain look, that there is a level of identity that the industry can't necessarily account for, but that you as the wearer are always bringing to that. That's essentially presentation. But in terms of what I'm reading right now, Norton released a very long 2-volume book on the history of fashion that I routinely consult. There is The Consumer Reader, which is pretty good, and I'm always going back to that. That's a collection of essays from writers in the modern era, mostly American, that are focused on how consumption plays a part of our everyday life, and some of the pitfalls that we fall into. And then there are the classics. There's Veblen, there's Bourdieu, there is Benjamin. And so I feel like they're all a part of my universe depending on what I'm thinking about and also depending on what trends are popping up. I'm always thinking like they nailed it way before social media, way before TikTok. Nothing has really changed. And that's incredible to kind of constantly remind ourselves of.
So you've written about that clothes communicate, that it's a social system every human participates in, but hardly anybody is taught to read. What's the business cost of brands not kind of understanding that language?
I think the business cost is a lack of trust on the consumer end. We really rely on brands just as much as we rely on fashion magazines and media to really distill trends for us to be able to make it our own. And when the brand doesn't understand the language, then how are we meant to understand it and translate it for ourselves? And so we don't know what to do with you when you can't make that connection for us. And I think that there are a couple of brands, and I'm not going to name names, I'm not going to pick on them, but I do think that there are a couple of brands that have really lost sight of that role, right? Direct to consumer did it very well, but direct to consumer has a whole other host of issues in terms of that trust and reliability at play. But the core brands that we've been living with for the past 40 years, the mall brands, the mid tiers that we know, we really still rely on them. And I hope that they really come back to recognizing that as a key feature of what they offer us.
You had a challenging year and you ended up rebuilding your wardrobe after clearing it out. What was that experience like? And how did that inform your writing and your thought?
You know, it's interesting. Fashion theory will remind you that there's no new emotion. And so, having gone through this year, I've been very careful whenever I've talked about it to say it doesn't matter what happened because my response was pretty textbook. I got rid of everything. I have a shaved head, so I couldn't, give myself bangs. I guess I could have colored my hair, but the first thing to go were my clothes because it just felt like the weight that I no longer needed. Throughout last year, I relied on a vintage sweatshirt, a single stitch white t-shirt, and a pair of 505 Levi's that are, I think, about as old as I am. And it really taught me simplify, make it easier on yourself. Those are the things that were most reliable in my wardrobe. And, the designer stuff, the super rare vintage pieces are great, but sometimes you just got to get back to basics. And I realized that's my basic. Now, I did not get rid of those pieces, but they are squirreled away to the bottom of my closet. I don't need to pull them out anytime soon. But really, as I build my wardrobe back, I'm thinking about those pieces, what feels super reliable, what feels like I can put it on day to day, and it is going to show up for me. That's going to be comfortable. It's still going to be part of this new version of myself. Text, an academic journal can't capture the emotion of that sort of simplicity and that sort of ability to kind of rebuild after a tough time.
Last question. What does fashion and fashion apparel and retail mean to you?
You know, I don't really believe in this democratized notion of fashion because in order for fashion to truly be democratic, the mass produced item has to retain the same meaning as the authentic original that it's meant to represent. But I do believe that it is incredibly important in terms of transformation and growth. It's a way that we can be able to tell time in a really interesting sensory way. And it's important from the standpoint that it does give us a sense of independence. It does give us a sense of self and the body, the self, how we function in society. Those things cannot really be separated. And so fashion is really sort of that external layer of being able to communicate who we are to the world in a way that doesn't have to shout, that doesn't have to just sort of scream in our favor, but it can do that very quietly and sort of protect.
No, that's great. Jessica, thank you so much for your time. This is great. It's a pleasure to speak with you. Continued success with your blog moving forward and the newsletter. And remind me again, it's a Sunday Journal? Is that
It's a
the
Sunday
title?
journal. Yep,
Okay.
on
Well, we'll
Substack.
have yeah, Substack. So, audience, go check it out, and then we'll probably be back at some point later on, and we'll catch up and see what's new down in the market. So, thanks for tuning in, and
Thank
Jessica, thank you so much.
thank you.